Excellent. So this is really fun. It's obviously a great pleasure to be here. It's a great pleasure to talk, not just in front of sort of my colleagues that I've had the pleasure of working with over the years, but also with people who actually do things in the real world and get punished when they get it wrong or not. So does anybody recognize either of these two pictures here? Okay, so one of these, right, one of these is the trading floor of Solomon Brothers, and the other is the tennis court in Versailles, where the king had gathered a bunch of people to have a conversation about maybe raising the debt ceiling, and then something happened which really began the nation state and the 21st century. One of the larger themes of this meeting, right, is this shift that we want people to make from seeing danger in terms of what Mirta called risk, right, quantifiable risk, the kinds of things you can measure with a probability distribution, shifting away from that to this larger concept of uncertainty, the introduction of novelty, of novel concepts, things that had not been thought of before, the unanticipated. And my claim is that systems like these, right, they don't just produce risk, right, they just don't produce, a coin toss, right? That's not what happens in buildings like this, right? What they actually produce is the potential for the unexpected and the unpredicted. Charlie earlier this morning kicked us off in the first talk with this story about how potentially in a supply chain what we're doing is we're optimizing for the short-term fluctuations. The events whose probabilities we can come to learn over time, like, the Iranians are, okay, well, we don't trade with the Iranians, it's a bad example. Like, the South Koreans are late with that object that they usually get on time, and we can build that in. So now we have to keep a little larger reserve, right? So we can learn the short fluctuations. But what Charlie tells us, right, is that the long tail events, right, the extreme events that can break a system, that can shut down a factory entirely for weeks, right, those long tail events make the system fragile. And that's, okay, so we have this wonderful term for this that we get from Taleb, right, which is this idea of the black swan. I think that while the black swan is a nice way to look at risk, it's certainly a challenging one for people, and it's easy for us to forget, I think the phrase is misleading. And that's because unpredictability is not just about the really large stuff, right? It's also about the very small stuff. It's about the social. So to drive that home, let me just sort of start with a puzzle. It's something that I noticed at some point. You may have noticed it as well. Probability theory, the stuff that I teach in an introductory college class, some of you probably learned it in high school, depending on where you were educated. Probability theory was invented in the European tradition, at least, basically in the late 17th or early 18th century, late 1600s. So this is really strange, right? Like, why did it take so long to figure out probability theory? It's not that hard, right? So to put this in context, right, we already had calculus. Right? We already had an enormous number of really complicated mathematical systems, right? Like most college graduates, right, get up to like 1580 in terms of mathematical sophistication. Except, so why did it take so long for probability theory to get invented? Was Isaac Newton that like dumb, right? Why didn't he figure it out? And it's like a double problem, right? Because you would think, right, like if you know a little probability theory, right? I mean, this is what this building's kind of built on, or at least people might think this is what this building is built on, right? You know a little bit of probability theory, you can just clean up at the track, right? But it's completely ridiculous that people couldn't calculate really basic things, like what's the probability of this poker hand, right? So what's going on, right? Why were we so dumb? And I have an explanation for this. What you have to do is you have to look at the games that people were playing, right? So here's like the dice. Right? Mirta had this picture of dice, right, that she used, right? And there's these perfectly machined dice that, are ratified by the Las Vegas Gaming Commission, right? This is what actual dice look like. They're not perfect objects at all. Every die that you played with, like here's knuckle bones, right? Like these are not reliable, repeatable objects that produce deterministic probabilities over long time scales, right? When you used to play these games, when someone would say to you, hey, you want to play a game of dice, right? It would be pointless to say, well, if these dice were perfectly machined to 21st century tolerances, then I can tell you exactly what the bets I should place are. But we were completely unable to do that, right? Not because it wouldn't have been useful, but because we didn't have the objects themselves, right? The production, right? We had to engineer, right, probability It doesn't really exist in the natural world, right? These kinds of games, you can imagine what it would have been like to play these games, right? Today we teach students like, oh, what's the probability of rolling double sixes? How much do you want to bet on that, right? Okay, then we work it out, and if someone offers us a bet greater than that, we put all our money on it and we win. That's the idea, right? Back in the day, you had no idea what the weight on a six was. It's all how you threw it, right? So you're kind of going back and forth. Yeah, I'll play some dice. Like, I want to gamble. That's a human constant, right? So you play, and you sort of gradually over time, you kind of work out how the game is going, and you start to figure out, is this guy good at tossing these dice in ways to get him the result he wants, right? These are negotiated facts, right? In contrast, in other words, to risk, to probability, right? Unpredictability fundamentally arises from a process of social negotiation, right? I mean, think about playing cards, right? Card games before you had perfectly machined backs to the cards. Right? Where with a little bit of skill, you might be able to tell what card a person was holding just because of some mistake on the pattern on the back. Okay? So in other words, over the course of my career, I've become less interested in these kind of clever puzzles of probability theory, right? And much, much more interested in the conditions under which novelty emerges, under which unpredicted events that we didn't foresee occur, right? As you learn over time how to toss a die, it's not like you're selecting between three options. You're trying to learn this dynamically in a social group. So, okay, I will tell you, so crash course in quantifying unpredictability. I'm going to show you how to quantify unpredictability, the unpredicted. Okay, and then I'm going to apply it to a couple systems. I'm going to apply it to the French Revolution, obviously, as promised, and to string theory. And I'll also apply it to an online system as well. So has anyone here played the game? I mean, I'm sure you have, right? The game 20 Questions, sometimes called Animal, Vegetable, Mineral. Okay. Right? So this is like the heart of all of information theory, right? So the game, just to sort of catch you up to it, if you haven't played it since you were a child, right, is there's two players, right? There's a parent and there's a child, right? And the parent thinks of something, and the child has to figure out what the parent's thinking about, right? And the rule is the child can only ask yes/no questions. So this is kind of fun, right? At least if you're 5 years old, right? So Will, will you play this with me? Okay, so, I'm the parent here, Will, if you don't mind. So I'm thinking of, I've got it in my head. Okay, go.
Is it a car?
No.
Does it start with a letter between A and K?
Okay, so somebody has gone to college. There is, of course, right, this sense that it's a game where you're trying to probe what the person's thinking about. The joke I usually tell is this was actually not just a game that you played with children, but in the Cold War era in Poland, this was actually a game show on communist Polish television. And what they would do is they bring, like the plumbers union would come up and they'd literally play 20 questions on television for the country to see. So this game famously ended when somebody like Will showed up. It was actually the Polish Mathematicians Union. And they said basically like, okay, comrades, we're thinking of it. Now, please ask your questions. And they said, okay, does it fall in the first half of the alphabet or the second half, right? And they say, okay, first half. And you say, okay, does it fall in the first half of the first half, right? Or does it fall in the second half of the first half, right? And that's actually, it turns out, quite an efficient way to drill down. And now that we have you thinking about that possibility, right, the idea that some questions are better than others, right, you can start to think about an optimal way to ask these questions, right? So here's a sort of simple version, right? Imagine you're playing 20 questions against your father, okay? And there's three possible options: tree, bird, and car, okay? And you know your father, and he tends to think about cars a lot, like 50% of the time, let's say, right? So what's the optimal question to begin with if your goal is to get this game over with as soon as possible? Car, well done, yes, okay, right? Is it a car? Because like half the time, right, the answer is yes, and the game, done, right? Okay, but no, right? Then, okay, well, you say, like, is it a bird, perhaps, right? And then, okay, now you have to split. In fact, it doesn't matter. Is it a bird? Is it a tree, right? Either question, right, the yes or no will now settle it for you. So on average, right, given the kind of game player your father is, you can get this game over as quickly as 1.5 questions on average, right? So this is what we call uncertainty, at least in the information theoretic sense. We call it information. Sometimes we call it entropy. It turns out we can compute this number here without constructing the optimal script. We use this formula. It's Shannon's entropy formula, right? So what this enables us to do, this is our first step. What this enables us to do, right, is to work out, given some set of events whose probabilities we know, right, so we're still in this world of risk, right, given this world of events, right, how uncertain am I about the outcome, right, on average, how many yes-no questions, right, imagine each one costs $1 to ask, right, how many yes-no questions do I need on average, right? So I play this game, right, like just to show you, that it can be applied beyond sort of simple toy models. One of the things I'm interested in is how people use language, right? So imagine you take like a novel, like you take Jane Austen, right, her novel Pride and Prejudice. You stick your hand in the novel, you pull out a word, right? You're playing this game, right? How many yes-no questions does your opponent need on average, right, before they can figure out what the word is, right? So I'm holding the word, and you can ask any yes-no question you want, right? How many yes-no questions on average? Any guesses? 10. Wow. Okay. Most people tend to overguess. It's about 9. 9 bits is the unit, right? So all we do there, right, what we're doing is we're quantifying the extent to which some process, right, is more or less predictable given the probabilities known ahead of time. So that gets us about halfway there, right? It's like you learn a system. Some systems are more random than others, right? And this number here quantifies that uncertainty, right? Okay. So once we have a sense of optimal questions, right, now we can also ask this possibility of suboptimal questions. So that was our script for the father, right? But let's imagine you're playing against your mother, okay? And your father, he was biased towards cars, right? Your mother, like, she's like a theoretical ecologist, right? So she's biased towards trees, right? Now, if you use the script you built for your father on your mother, it's no longer optimal, right? It fails, right? And in fact, it fails, right, by about a quarter of a question, right? So you could get the game over with your mother just as quickly as with your father. You had to use a different script. But you're stuck with your father's script. You didn't expect your mother to show up and play this game with you, right? So you use that script. And now you're about a quarter of a question inefficient, right? So this is the crucial quantity that measures the extent to which an event, right, is unpredicted, right? What is unpredicted is not simply something that has some probability of occurring greater or less. It's the extent to which what's happening is violating the expectations you've built up, right? You expected your father. You built a script for that. You organized your perceptual system around that. You organized your information gathering system around that. And now the world changes, okay? And it turns out we can quantify this as well. It's called Kullback-Leibler divergence, okay? But we just call it surprise, right? Surprise, like you can calculate it. One way to think of it is how many extra questions you'll need to ask, right, if you think that you're encountering distribution Q, state of the world Q, but you actually get this other distribution P, right? We call this surprise. So let's just apply this. We'll apply this case of string theory, right? So we took a database. This is a question we've had about how mathematicians work, how scientists work. We began with mathematics. We began to study mathematics in part because, well, it's a fascinating system. Mathematicians tend to write their papers in a certain way, right? They tend to write mostly in English, right? And we're also interested in mathematics because it's a kind of a free-running system, right? It has no constraints. Like mathematicians basically can do whatever they want, right? And we seem to pay them anyway, right? This is a little study by a French sociologist who went and studied mathematicians. Like, what do mathematicians think they're actually doing? 62% of them just think like we're playing a game with the appeal of the unknown. Right? So this is a system where people are trying to find things that are new, right? They're going out to seek the unpredicted, right? So we got this database actually from the string theory subset. Whether string theory is a science or mathematical field is a good question at this point. We have about 26,000 articles, right, over the course of about a decade in the development of this, right? So what we do here, very simply, right, we take all the papers that have been written in string theory, right, and we model them as sort of a bag of words. In the same way I said, imagine sticking your hand into Pride and Prejudice. Now I can say, imagine sticking your hand into, one of these objects, right, one of these papers, right? So we model each paper as a probability distribution over words, right? And then we say, okay, look, right, how surprising is some paper given the constellation of papers that came before it, right? People have been writing, they've been setting up patterns in your mind, or if you're a string theorist, in the mind of a string theorist, right? And then a new paper comes along. How novel is it, right? To what extent, right, does this paper here violate the expectations that have been set up by the system as a whole in, let's say, the previous 6 months, right? So we can plot this out, right? We can sort of run this grind this equation through. And actually, like the first thing we find, right, is like there's basically kind of a constant rate of short-term innovation happening in science, right? There's sort of, people are writing papers, they don't copy exactly what comes before, they vary it in some way. And there's kind of this constant rate of churn, right? One of the things that's kind of interesting is that we look on longer and longer timescales. This is just like, okay, you write a paper, how does that compare to what's come before, like in the previous 6 months? So you look on longer timescales, right? And so what you find, in fact, if you look on longer and longer timescales, it actually seems like physics, or at least this part of physics, is slowing down, right? So in 1996, right, the 3-year innovation rate was actually much higher than it was in 2003. So one way to say is like, here's like science kind of jumbling around, right? In the past, it was sort of jumbling around and moving, and now it's, okay, it's sort of slowing down and becoming perhaps almost stationary, which is sort of a surprise to us. So this is the idea of surprise, right, compared to the past, right? So, how novel is some kind of pattern given all the patterns you've set up before, right? And we sort of thought about that for a while, and we did the sort of standard physics move, right? We say, well, okay, like, here it is, this compared to this. Well, like, what if you flip it, right? Instead of just considering surprise compared to the past, what if you consider surprise compared to the future? Right? How surprising is something now given what's going to come next? That's a bit of a strange thing, right? We can quite know how to understand that. You think about that for a second, though, right? If something is surprising compared to the future, right, how would you express that? You might say something along the lines of, if you imagine you go for your performance review, and it's like, Will, you don't look like the future of this company, right? This is not good news for you, right? You're sort of surprising given what the composition of this company is going to look like in the future, right? Basically, surprise to the future is not novelty, it's transience, right? And so we can now plot this. So here's every paper in sort of 10 years of string theory. On the x-axis here is surprise given the past, right? So how novel the object is. And on this axis here is surprise given the future, how transient it is, right? Okay, and you don't need a big data, right, machine learning model to tell you that these things are very strongly correlated, right? So another way to put this, right, like the first law of the unpredictable, right, is like what is new is quickly forgotten. Right? There's a reason nobody had that crazy idea that, that you just came up with. There's a reason, and the reason is it kind of sucks. It doesn't work, and we're going to forget it. Right? This is sort of, if you do a problem set and your professor says, like, I've never seen anybody try to solve the problem that way before, it probably doesn't mean you've solved the problem well. Right? So what hasn't been seen before won't be seen much again, right? So that's the sort of general trend, right? Sort of the sad fact of life, right? But then you say, okay, well, like let's look at some of these guys. Like let's look at this guy here. Notice this guy. He's off the trend, right? So he's novel. He's surprising compared to the past, but he's not as transient as most of his friends. Like, so you look at that paper. What's that paper? Okay, I'm sure it's a great paper. One way you know it's a great paper, it's in the top 5% of all the citations, right? And what it turns out is that even though it's a very risky move to deviate from the past, because you tend to be forgotten, that in fact is where all of the action is. That's what's driving the system forward, and that's what's getting celebrated, right? This kind of magical world, out here, right? This magical world out here is where the progress in physics is coming from, right? The system is selectively honoring the new, right? And in some sense, okay, like this is surprising, not surprising, it's sort of hard to say. People usually think they always have a theory that there's some sweet spot of novelty. We've never, it's like be crazy but not too crazy. As far as we can tell, that theory is just wrong. We can tell your intuition is wrong on this one, right? There's basically, you can go if you can take the risk, right? There's no limit to the reward, right? And you sort of know this from investments. So if you can withstand a really high volatility, you can get some really high growth rates, right? People have this idea like don't be too crazy, right? Turns out the appetite for novelty is extreme. And so let's go to our next example here from the French Revolution, right? So by the way, I'm not sure if Neil's still here, right? These are the millennials, okay? This is like a couple cycles before, right? These are basically one of the sort of fourth generation turning points, right? That he talks about here, right? This is in 1789, right? So what happens, right? Briefly, summary of the French Revolution, right? Louis XVI, right? He's the king. He's a terrible king. Like most kings, he runs out of money, right? But unfortunately, he doesn't have the political power just to get more. So what he does is he calls something called the Estates General, right? And this is this like ancient mythical body that is going to enable him to raise taxes or at least raise money, get it from somewhere. The problem is the last time they had called the Estates General was like 170 years before, right? 1614, right? So like nobody had any idea what this thing meant, right? It would sort of be like if we called a constitutional convention, right? Which maybe we will do, okay? But like nobody had any idea what this was going to mean. And since 1614, like a lot of things had happened, like Rousseau and like all these people had showed up and built a theory of Enlightenment governance and all these things, right? So people show up at Versailles. There's 12,000 people. It's about 3 times the size of the largest democratic body that's ever been assembled. That's the British Parliament. Way more than we have in the States, right? There's 53 people in the Founding Fathers, quote unquote, right? So this is orders of magnitude larger, right? This is truly a complex, chaotic system, right? Within 5 years, in case you didn't know this, right, within 5 years of this great celebratory moment, right, the entire system collapses. It collapses into paranoia, it collapses into terror, right? What's called the third estate, the bourgeoisie, the middle class, the bourgeoisie turns on itself, right? They start executing each other, right? Now, at the same time, right, that 5 years is kind of this amazing period, right, where some of the first European institutions are conceived of, right? So they write, for example, the Declaration of the Rights of Man. They write it actually, like, basically in a week, right? They write the first human rights document. They free the slaves, right? It's just like, well, that clearly that's what we're going to do. So they free the slaves in Haiti, right? One thing they don't do, all the people in our data are men. They haven't quite figured out that women are people. They'll figure that out in like 100 years later. But unfortunately, despite that, we do have the records of their discussions. So in that assembly hall, we know what they were saying to each other, right? And does anyone here speak French? All right, okay, well, so you're a little far back, but it's like you could actually read the blow by blow of the French Revolution, at least in that elite parliament home, right? Okay, and so like most of it, I don't know if you've ever been to like faculty, I guess your meetings are probably just as bad as ours, right? If you've ever been to faculty meeting, right? Most of it is like really boring, right? So like every morning during the French Revolution, they wake up and they go to the meeting and they argue about the minutes, right? So like the first thing is like, okay, we're going to read the minutes, and I have an objection to the minutes because you said this thing. I actually think we should be okay, fine. Then they get over the minutes, right? But then a lot of other things actually start to happen, right? So here's like a little great moment in the French Revolution, right, where somebody says like, I want to speak on this, right? And then, of course, it's quite chaotic. This is a very big room, and so people that are sort of friendly to this person are like saying, order, order, listen to him, right? Then somebody else shouts out, you don't have the right to speak right now. And then the first, somebody else says, oh, no, wait, I just have 3 things to say, right? And then somebody else jumps in, he's like, look, I think the manner in which you guys are saying this is really offensive. Like, it's very millennial, I think. It's like, it's very, this is not something that I really feel like is, it's like a safe space, right? Then it says like, members on the left, why are you speaking? The members in the center, like, let him speak, right? And then finally this goes on and on. And at the end it says the president, the guy who's supposedly running things, like the Will Tracy in the room, says, look, if the discussion is going to continue, Robespierre will have the right to speak. Okay, so we'll see who Robespierre is in a moment, right? So this is work that I've done with Alexander Behrens, a graduate student, Jenny, an undergrad, and then Rebecca is our sort of historian informant, right? So you've seen this cloud before, okay? These are all the speeches in the French Revolution. You saw it in all the papers in string theory, right? On the x-axis here is novelty, on the y-axis is transient, right? Surprise towards the past, surprise towards the future. Just like in string theory, right? New stuff, right, tends to be transient. What hasn't been seen before will not be seen much again, right? So you understand this, right? But now, okay, we can really get a sense of who the players in the revolution are, right? Because we can ask, like, who, despite their novelty, can avoid, right, the trap of transience? Who can inject novelty into the system, right? And what we find is a fascinating two splits here, right? We have the left wing and the right wing. Of course, we get the phrase left and right. By the way, why is the left on the left, right? The left's on the left because that's where they just happened to start sitting at the beginning of the revolution. That's where that geometric metaphor shows up, right? It turns out that geometric metaphor is totally wrong. That's not how you should think of the left and the right, okay? Here's the left-wing speakers, right? The left-wing speakers are these guys, right? They're really high novelty, right? So they're saying all these new things, right? But the most prestigious speakers in that group are able to inject novelty and not have it be dissipated out, right? And right at the top there is Robespierre, okay? Famous sort of radical leader of like what we would end up calling the hard left. Robespierre is distinguished on our plots, right, not by the ideology here, but by his relationship to the conversations that people are having. Robespierre's the guy, when you're saying something and Robespierre speaks next, he just basically takes the conversation in a new direction, and he has the prestige and the authority. Something in what he's doing means that when he takes the conversation in a new direction, other people follow. Okay? He's like the worst person, in other words. He's like the person that just derails the conversation and takes it somewhere else. He has a competitor, Villeneuve, right? Villeneuve is kind of, they have a bit of a sort of, I wouldn't call it, it's not a friendly rivalry, they have kind of sort of a bro rivalry, right? To see who will be this person, right? Villeneuve and Robespierre basically achieve the highest levels of this ability to go here and there at the same time, right? Conversely, let's take a look at the right wing, right? So the right wing dominated mostly by a couple aristocrats who have the stomach for it. Most of them get out of town, right? Some of them have the stomach for it. A couple priests, including Abbé Mouret, right? Sort of what they do, right? What does the right wing do, right? The right wing is sort of this kind of strange restoring force. So what Abbé Mouret, for example, is doing, what somebody on the right is doing, or at least the most prestigious members on the right, is they're keeping the conversation on track. So like Will says something, right? And then if somebody on the right wing speaks, what he does actually is he brings the conversation, he keeps the conversation in that vein. And in fact, what he's able to do is buck the innovation bias in the system as a whole, right? So it's rare, right, that if it's rare because the system ends up rewarding novelty, right? It's rare to be low novelty, right, and anomalously low transience, right? But right wing, at least the most prestigious right wing members, can make this happen, right? So it's not left versus right. It's not this point versus that point. It's more like a centripetal force and a centrifugal force in terms of how the conversation is evolving over time, right? So the obvious question is, what happens if you do this on the congressional record? We're working on it, right? You can see some of the speakers here, right? So Robespierre. Oh, sorry, this is Barnave. Barnave is sort of, if under this picture, right, he's somebody who loses on both sides, right? He has low novelty and very high transience, right? So he's like, Will says something, right? And then Barnave is like, Will's like, oh, what about blockchain? And Barnave's like, yes, the blockchain. And then everyone's like, all right, anyway, on to, right? So that's Barnave. You can see him, he's over there, right? He's like, ah, right? Okay. Whereas Robespierre, you can see him if you look on the screen. So I mean, he's just freaking out, right? He's the most passionate member who can control the system. So that we thought that was the story, right? But then if you have really good people you work with, like Alexander, then you find out actually there's something else going on, because you realize that actually what the French do is they discover a way to mass produce uncertainty. Okay, so what Alexander noticed, and what we've sort of known as from the historical record, is that they're having this big debate and it's getting chaotic, but they have to run the world too. France is at this point the largest nation in Europe, the largest nation state in Europe, right? They have a military, they have to do the budget, right? They have to run the finances, right? They're inventing a currency. They don't have blockchain at this point, right? So they have to invent a currency out of nothing, right? And what they do to handle that is invent committees, right? So people, they're like, okay, look. Mirta, you run the psychology committee and report back, right? So we can see the committee speech, right? And in the early part of the French Revolution, the committee speech, people who are speaking on behalf of a committee, right, look basically like everybody else, right? It's like, look, I got a point to make. By the way, remember, a committee, like, we've thought about this. Here's what we're thinking, right? And they look pretty much indistinguishable from anybody else, right? What happens by the second half, something very strange happens, right? These little green dots here, the committee speeches, right? They start kind of shifting out. So what's happening here is the committee speech is becoming increasingly novel, increasingly new, right? So people who are speaking on behalf of a committee, like their words are coming out of nowhere. No one's seen this kind of use before, right? Now, it's very new, and at the same time, it's very transient. And we're like, well, this is strange, right? These committees somehow, like, they're being very new, but they're kind of fading away, so maybe they're not that important. But if you look in the record, actually what's happening is the opposite. Committees are gaining the power to propose and dispose. They show up and they say, we in the committee have decided this. That's the end of the story. Everybody accepts it. And then they move on, not because they've ignored what the committee has said, but because they've accepted it so completely that they now have to start a new debate. Right? The committees, in other words, turn out to be not the orators, right? The orators are not the ones who are controlling things at this point, right? It's the committees. They've basically circumvented the dynamical democratic debate that they began with, right? And of course, the committees, if you know anything about the French Revolution, there's a famous committee that shows up called the Committee for Public Safety, right? The Committee for Public Safety is, of course, associated with executing half the people in our data, right? So half the people in our data execute the other half, right? Through control of these committees. Like Mirta shows up and she's like, look, the committee has decided that Will Tracy is an enemy of the people, right, and a danger to public safety, and then they're executed. Okay. So, right, here's what we have so far, right? This story, right, of how systems manage the new, right? Like something like string theory, they don't have committees yet, right? So people are publishing papers, their novelty is getting more or less rewarded, right? Selectively choosing those risky papers, right, that introduce new ideas to form the center of the discipline going forward, right? And we also have this story about how in, more free debate, right, people find ways to circumvent the standard structures of how the system processes information, right? So I'm going to try and put these together. I sort of promised, right, I would tell you, not just what we do with the unpredictable, right, but I sort of promised I'd tell you where the unpredictable comes from, right? It's not just, okay, this crazy thing has happened. Robespierre said something. What do we do with it? Do we incorporate it? Do we discard it, right? But it's also like, what is the nature of these events that produce these kinds of uncertainties? Right? What's introducing new things into the system? What are the underlying mechanisms that produce it, right? So in order to study this, we went to another system. This is Wikipedia. Who here has edited Wikipedia? This is a question I always ask. Will has. Oh, Oscar. Okay. Did you edit your own? Glad to hear it. Who has used Wikipedia? We don't raise. I mean, I know you're lying. So, like, Wikipedia is like this crazy joke, right? Because it was a system famously like democracy and like the free market. It's a system that like works in practice but doesn't work in theory. You have no idea why it works. No one knows. At this point in time, Supreme Court decisions cite Wikipedia, right? Your doctor will look up on Wikipedia the medicines that he's going to prescribe you, right? It's the extent to which this has become the sort of default reference system is remarkable. It's also remarkable, of course, like it's one of the largest websites and it has like a staff of 5 people with, just this nonprofit sitting there. No one really understands it. The most edited article on Wikipedia, anyone want to guess? Will knows this because he's heard me say this. The most edited article on Wikipedia? This man. In fact, George Bush's article, one of the reasons it's so edited over such a long period of time is, of course, the presidency of George Bush kind of coincides with the early growth of the system. There's 45,000 edits to this article over the course of its lifetime since it was first created. 45,000, right? And most of those edits, like things are getting put in and things are getting taken out, right? So okay, then we ask, okay, look, we'll do the same thing, right? We know when people write a string theory paper, say, what does it look like compared to what's come before? Robespierre makes a speech, somebody makes a speech. How does it compare to the speeches that came before, right? So now we can ask, like, somebody edits Wikipedia. How does that edit take the page to a new state that has or has not been seen before? And we can produce the same kind of trajectory of surprise, right? Here's what it looks like, sort of like this kind of weird EKG, right? If we smooth it out a little bit, you can start to see it, right? So here's what's happening in Wikipedia, right? Basically, people are editing the system, they're editing the page, right? Going along. And then at some point, something happens, like pow, right? The surprise goes way up, right? Something's happened to that system. Some new structure has been introduced that makes the page surprising given what's come before. And then it kind of decays, right? And then pow, right? You have these bursts of surprise that we often think of as sort of these paradigm shifts in how the page should be written. What's happening here is the page is being taken to new states that are completely unanticipated given what's come before, these kinds of innovation bursts, right? Now you can zoom in to one of these bursts and say, okay, what's there? Right? We had to sort of convince ourselves, like maybe you're wondering, like, is Kullback-Leibler divergence, is this really what's going, like, really, right? So you can zoom in. We'll just take this first one here. You can look on either side, right, of that first burst and say, okay, what was happening in the page? What were people doing there, right? You can look. I won't make you read the George Bush page, like 2 versions of it, right? It's just very sort of scholarly. But if you look, just look at the table of contents. Here's the table of contents before the burst. Here's the table of contents after the burst. Right? Most of the stuff has just been moved around. Not much has happened there, right? Except the big thing that's been introduced, right? The big thing that's been introduced is now all of a sudden people are deciding that the George Bush page should also talk about sort of controversies surrounding George Bush. Okay. So what's happening here is that people are changing, they're changing the nature of what this page is meant to be doing. Right? They're changing the nature of what kinds of discussions should be had on Wikipedia, whether or not this is appropriate or not, right? It's something like early on they had maybe an Encyclopedia Britannica theory of what this page should be doing. Later, more of a kind of news, like current events version of the page, right? So these innovation bursts are real, right? What people are doing is changing the page in such a way, taking it to a new event. And I guess if we were to go back to this question of the black swan, is this a black swan? Well, yes and no, right? It's not something that destroys the system. It's not an extreme event except in terms of its unpredictedness. It's not extreme in some other dimension, right? This is just the regular kind of bumps of social life, right? This is how societies grow and change, right? What's nice about the Wikipedia case is we have these sort of multiple runs for each page. So we asked, where do these bursts come from? Where do these bursts of novelty come from, right? And one of the questions I have a sort of Karl Popper sort of view of the world, right? I think conflict is intrinsic to the way we do things, right? Peer review is a fundamentally conflict-based system. The free market is a fundamentally conflict-based system, right? It's not like all the businesses sit down together and debate what the best idea is. Everybody disagrees and then somebody goes bankrupt. At least that's the ideal version, right? Same thing with democracy, right? It's not like, the two kings sort of debate with each other and figure out what the right thing to do is. Like one of them wins the election and one of them loses. So I was interested in studying the relationship between these bursts, between these emergences of unpredictability, or the unpredicted, right? And we can actually study the relationship between those emergences, right, and conflict. So there's a wonderful thing about Wikipedia is that you can see people fight, right? And it's sort of fun if you want to amuse yourself, like take a page right? If you have some special, affection for a certain kind of conflict, right? I suggest you do this, right? Take this page. The Israel-Palestine conflict. This is a page describing the conflict. As you can imagine, right, the internet's theory of what the Israel-Palestine conflict is about is like constantly in flux, right? We can look at the history of this page. We can look at how this page has evolved over time. So I'll show you that now. It's sort of hidden behind this page is its history, right? So this is just reading up the page here, right? These are the edits that people have made, right? So at each of these lines here, right, is somebody, this is somebody showing up and doing something to the page and changing it, taking it to a new state, right? Now, some of these edits, right, are just, people adding things or deleting things, right? Some of them are special. They're what we call reverts, okay? This is where somebody has made an edit to the page, like somebody's come into the page, right, done something to it, and then somebody else has come along later and said, like, what you did is so crap, right, that there's nothing I can do except just undo what you did. I'm going to hit Control-Z on you. That's what we call a revert, right? So you can see here's a revert, right? So user Schmooth, I'll read this to you since you can't see it. So this is just a randomly chosen part of the history. Schmooth shows up, right, at 3 minutes to midnight on 28th of November. And Schmooth says he does something to the page, and actually he tells you what he does. He says, look, I added a small paragraph explaining what the conflict is actually about, as the current article fails in this most basic of tasks, right? Like what could possibly go wrong, right? So 3 minutes later, the user Daniel shows up, and Daniel just says basically no. Like, we've all been working on the page for a long time. Thank you for not really thank you. Like, you wrote a paragraph that attempted to explain, like, no, right? RV, revert. I've taken it out. In fact, we see another one just a little bit later. Somebody else shows up, like, I'm making this little edit, and somebody shows up afterwards and says, you know what, like, you didn't make a small edit. You're, like, trying to push your particular point of view, and like, I don't even want to deal with it. I'm reverting you, right? So these revert moments here are signals of really strong disagreement about what's happening on the page itself, right? So we can take any page and do this, and we can turn it into a series of reverts that we either call creative or reverting, right? So a C edit takes a page to the state you've never seen before, but an R is this revert kind of edit, which says somebody's done something. No, I'm going to take it back, right? So you can see this is the time series now for the George Bush page, right? That's actually that's the creation of the George Bush page back in 2001, okay? Then there's another edit, and you see the third edit that we have a record of in Wikipedia is actually a revert, right? Somebody got mad already, right? But you can see this kind of goes on. You see these long strings of cooperation, then it's like, I got mad. No, like, it's fine. No, I'm still mad, right? You can see these little bursts of conflict that emerge in the system, right? So they're just really basic questions, right? What's the relationship between these two things? What's the relationship between conflict and innovation, between conflict and the emergence of unpredicted, right? So, well, what's the answer, right? Do reverts tend to be associated with the emergence of new material or not? So this is what I was taught to do this when I was lecturing in college. It's called pedagogy of the awkward. Associated. You're wrong. Ha! That's also a terrible teaching move. Don't take pleasure in your students being wrong. No, but thank you for playing along. I know it's because it's the end of the day, but trust me, it's going to get good, right? So look, here's what on the x-axis here, right? This is like how far away you are from a conflict, from a flashpoint, right? So the further you are away from a conflict, right, the more surprising your edit is going to be, right? The further you, like if people are fighting, on average, you say, look, there's a fight going on, it tends to be associated with the suppression of the introduction of novelty. Okay? So I was really disappointed, right? I was really disappointed because as somebody who liked the idea that like argument and like really going at it, right? Like no safe space, I thought this is terrible, right? So turns out the story is actually quite interesting. I won't tell you the details in this one, but it turns out there's two clearly detectable kinds of conflict in the system, right? A revert is not just a revert. If you undo somebody, right, depending on the context in which it happens, that revert can have one of two very distinct meanings. And in fact, we call these type 1 conflict and type 2 conflict. And now it turns out that in fact this relationship here turns out to be what we call in economics an ecological fallacy, right? It's when you mix two heterogeneous populations and get a trend that actually is the opposite of the trend that obtains within each population, right? So in fact, when you're in type 1 conflict, when you're in the kind of conflict that we can identify through machine learning, just in terms of the patterns of the C's and the R's, when you're in that kind of conflict, in fact, that's now associated with innovation. In fact, that's the highest rates of innovation we see in the system, right? Around those flashpoints, right? Around those flashpoints, we see the introduction of not just novelty, but I'm sure you're thinking persistent novelty, novelty that's not transient, right? When you're in type 2 conflict, just a disaster. In fact, there it doesn't really matter how far you are from like the nearby revert, right? There, anything is bad. Just nothing is happening. Those are the kinds of things where it's basically chaotic, right? Nobody really has a sense of what's going on. Type 1 conflict is the kind of ordered conflict that you might associate, at least we're trying to associate, with things like seminar discussion, right? So here's where we are. I have left as much time as my verbosity could allow me for questions, right? Here's where I began, right? It's like, hey, look, where does this unpredictable stuff come from? I taught you how to find it. Right? I taught you how to see it in the world in terms of this surprise metric, this Kullback-Leibler divergence, right? I tried to convince you, like, it's kind of amazing, right? If we say, look, physics papers, some of them break the mold, right? And the answer is, like, most of them that break the mold, right, are themselves, like, really quickly broken, right? But some kind of subpopulation there, right, this kind of innovation preferring system, right, that physics, or at least string theory is, right, desires this and rewards it selectively. In the French Revolution case, in the first iteration, what we think we see is a similar kind of thing, like Robespierre, like the great physicist, right? Robespierre is able to make arguments that deviate from the past and yet persist, right? But really, the secret history turns out to be this sort of almost bureaucratic innovation, right? It's like, forget making arguments to people, right? Just have committees that meet in secret and give them some power, and then they show up and they say, look, this is how it's going to be, and everybody accepts it, right? So that was kind of the innovation in some sense, right, that the French did, right? The Americans they took a lot longer to invent a committee because they were just 50 people in a room, right? They didn't really sort of patch things out for many, many years. The French had to do it right away because they were, who were we, right, back in the 1776? New York did not look like this, but Paris looks pretty much the same as it did back then. And then there's sort of this like deeper question, right? I mean, we have this sense, I think Kevin pushed a little bit at this, we have this sense, okay, like the introduction of unpredictability is bad, right? It's a danger. We don't want that. We don't want the unpredicted. Well, of course we do, right? That's science, right? That's culture. That's the next great artwork. Right, that's the next great social innovation, right? Democracy at some point was an unpredicted idea. Nobody had written this stuff down before, right? If we see the unpredicted solely as a source of danger, right, we may be, I don't know, robust, right? We may be able to take the shocks, right? But what you really want, of course, is you want some kind of unpredictability that allows you to change, right? You want to be a system that can take things that haven't been seen before and grow from them and thrive on them. It's what a good scientist does, certainly. It's what a good democracy does. And so we were interested in this question, right? Where do those things come from? Not just about their management after they show up, right? But what are the conditions under which these new ideas emerge, right? What are the situations under which people actually do something? They take a highly rarefied, highly competed thing, like the page describing like the least popular president in history until today, right? And change it and make that change stick, right? How does that happen, right? And okay, one of our theories, at least the theory that we're building here, is that fundamentally you have to allow some kind of conflict into the system. So I'll pause there and I'll let Will help manage questions on this work. Thank you very much for coming.